Looks like we need to talk a little more about Blizzie Knows Best and World of Warcraft's issues with world scaling. This is MultimediaJay Radio Style for Thursday, August 15th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay Radio Style.
Title says it all, folks. More on Blizzard's world scaling issues. This falls under the category of Blizzie Knows Best, and the usual rules apply. Whenever you see something with more on in the title, more on sounds like moron. So the question is always, who's the moron? I'm not going to talk about this any further, though, because I would much rather have this not disintegrate into a petulant, petty slap fight, because this comment that I'm responding to today was an attempt at some kind of discussion on the matter. However, through posting what this person posted, they show that it is nothing but sophistry. It is fishing for an argument. It is arguing for arguing's sake, maybe even thinking for thinking's sake. Something I am extremely familiar with because I dealt with this garbage in college. Usually from professors who tried to make themselves look smart by thinking backwards, as I called it at the time. Whatever the social norm, whatever the commonly accepted conclusion was regarding something they could think about, they instantly rejected it for the sake of trying to make themselves look like they were more thoughtful than most. And so you'd hear some really wacky arguments in some of those liberal arts classes because there was this idea that thinking for thinking's sake, even if it was overthinking a situation or being academic, as the rest of us out in the world would call it, there was this idea that that sort of behavior was a good thing. And you also see this stuff on the internet as well, particularly with arguments like what I'm responding to today. So we're going to read this verbatim as is before we start taking a look at it and going under the hood. But once we go under the hood, it doesn't take much at all to see that this person does not follow what I do on here. This is just a fly-by-night who doesn't get the meta of what the problem is with Blizzard. And what is that meta? Blizzie Knows Best. Institutionalized narcissism. The persistent talking down to the player base, aka the paying customers, that goes on with Blizzard's devs. Which doesn't fly today the way it did back in the heydays of WoW, when World of Warcraft was basically the king of the MMOs, and there were only two kinds of MMOs out there in the mainstream, World of Warcraft and every game that was trying to be World of Warcraft. That is no longer the case, and some of this residual behavior, this Blizzie Knows Best stuff, looks more ridiculous now than it did during its heyday, simply because the world has changed. And this whole thing with world scaling is a wonderful example of that. Now let's take a look at this comment verbatim before we start taking a look under the hood. I don't feel like you have provided your viewers with enough information. You claim that Blizzard created a half-cooked attempt to scale the world and you compare it to ESO. In ESO, you can go anywhere and do story elements at any time. This was not the intent when Blizzard implemented scaling. The intent was to allow people that were making another character, an alt, to go to the zones they preferred to level in instead of being forced to level in a particular area. By keeping level ranges on different continents, it allows the player to still feel progression. Is the game old? Yes, but if you put the graphics aside, you would have a hard time seeing all the content that WoW has to offer, even if you spent a couple of years playing the game. I am not a fan of Blizzard. I dislike a lot of the things they have done, but your viewers need to understand that you are giving them a very biased opinion with little information. Close quote. First off, mistake number one is to accuse anybody of having a biased opinion, because it's the same as accusing people of having wet water. Opinions are inherently biased, because the difference between a fact and an opinion is facts exist on their own, don't need to be supported, and people can observe them on their own without needing someone to tell them. Unless they have a hard time seeing things or perceiving, or they're not too informed on a situation or whatnot. But the bottom line with facts is that they're there, regardless of what people think of them or what people's views on them are. Opinions originate with people. Opinions are always biased, because by nature of being someone's opinion, which everybody has, valid or not, it is always going to be biased because opinions originate with people. It's people's takes on things. So biased opinion is inherently redundant. And I've gotten this in some of the comments in various videos over the years that accuse me of, oh, you made a biased video. Yes, I did. I gave my opinion on it. That's what opinions are, and opinions are not facts. And this is one of the reasons why I left this comment up instead of like, oh, let's block the guy, he disagreed with me, and that kind of stuff that happens elsewhere. Because this comment, number one, YouTube's been burying comments more and more, so it's harder to see them, especially on mobile. Number two, you actually have to click to see them. They're moving in the direction of various news sites whose comment sections often explode into a giant opinion war after every single time a news story is posted. So the folks are like, okay, let's make it so people have to click and actually want to see the comments in order to see them. YouTube's been inching towards that quite a bit. But technical stuff aside, the bottom line is this comment is an opinion and therefore it is not a fact. And the facts are on my side. If you fire up Guild Wars 2, why wasn't that mentioned, by the way? It's one of the games I compare WoW to. It's part of my discussion and where I come from on this matter. If you fire up Guild Wars 2, if you fire up ESO, if you fire up World of Warcraft, and you compare the world scaling, you can easily see where Blizzard comes up short in terms of features and what exactly the world scaling accomplishes. And quite frankly, the way Blizzard dealt with world scaling when it launched in 2018, the way Blizzard dealt with world scaling was exactly what I would expect from a narcissistic company that talks down to their players and squirms at any good idea that players bring up that already exists in other games. This is a long-running problem with them. If you've been following what I've been saying about this goes all the way back at least to Burning Crusade, probably happened in vanilla too. But the first real big example that I know of from Burning Crusade that was annoying a lot of people until it finally got implemented was free spell damage for healers. Once upon a time, and we're going to see this again in Classic, the healing gear would only boost your ability to heal. You would not get any offensive power from it. And it got so bad at one point that there were people playing priests in raiding guilds that were re-rolling warlocks, or they were rolling rogue alts to play the entire rest of the game outside of healing a raid. And the reverse was true as well. There were DPS players, I actually was friends with a rogue at the time, who created a healing character and had their guildies level it completely from scratch to become exclusively a raid healer. My rogue buddy rolled a healing paladin, a holy paladin, and his guild buddies power leveled him all the way up to Karazhan gear to be able to raid in SSC and other stuff as a healer. So he had a character that he otherwise would not have played exclusively for raid healing for his guild. And healers, who primarily played healers, had DPS alts exclusively for playing the entire rest of the game besides the raid healing they were doing, because it was so horrible to play by yourself as a healer before they gained any offensive power whatsoever. This was an idea that was getting tossed around in Warhammer at the time, which was a game that was getting bragged about. In the forums back in those days, you would see people saying WOW stands for Waiting on Warhammer and not World of Warcraft. So you would see that kind of stuff going on back in those days. And there were the discussions back and forth with the blues and, oh, no, I mean, if you're good at healing, you shouldn't be good at doing damage and this, that, and the other, until finally, offensive power for healers was sheepishly implemented with a ratio. There was gear that gave you spell damage and healing in roughly equal amounts. Healing gear only gave you healing ability, but that was changed to basically be more like 75-25. So if you got the healing set, your healing would be more powerful, but you get a boost to your offensive capabilities for doing stuff in the outdoor world. You wouldn't really be as good of a DPS as someone wearing the spell damage and healing gear. but the healing gear at least gave you something, so if you went pure healer, you could do something in the outdoor world without healing a tank buddy or a DPS buddy. Actually, I should probably say DPS buddy, because tanks also had problems with not being able to do damage at the same time that they were tanking. This was part of the back and forth discussion that eventually led to things like active mitigation and other things where tanks have to choose to either be tough or do damage. That's more of a thing these days than it was in those days. But this behavior, all the way back in the very first expansion pack of this game, was a great example of the kinds of back and forth discussions that have gone on since then and still continue to go on. And then we see, of course, behavior like the whole Diablo Immortal thing at BlizzCon, and things like, you think you do, but you don't. WoW Classic itself is a great example of this behavior. So, oh, no, we don't need to have an old version of the game out there because people think they want to play it again. We don't need that. And then Nostalrius and the other servers out there become what they are until eventually, finally, there's some kind of discussion between Blizzard and the Nostalrius folks. And now we have Classic coming out, being advertised as, come see what WoW was like in 2006. Yeah, it wasn't that long ago that this was some kind of thing that they were like, you think you want this, but no, you really don't. So, you've got examples of Blizzard's narcissism towards their players. Blizzie knows best. Recently, with the whole WoW Classic debacle, and now, suddenly it's going to be a thing now, and all the way back to Burning Crusade with free spell damage for healers. And there have been other discussions in the middle. That's what we're dealing with here. That's the meta. And that's why I'm not surprised by the world scaling and whatnot. Let's compare the world scaling right now. Especially with this thing about, Blizzard, they just wanted to, so you could pick where you want to level. That's a cop-out. Because World of Warcraft's been around long enough that there are certain areas of the game, like Outland, that are about as dated as it gets. And so when you have multiple expansion packs, then, and especially when you're pitting expansions against each other where one corrected the mistakes of the previous one, like Burning Crusade versus Wrath of the Lich King. What do you think is going to be the more popular leveling area, Outland or Northrend? Northrend! That's where you had this overarching story where you were gaining in power to go take down the Lich King. You would see the Lich King very early on. In Burning Crusade, there was no uniting villain that you were out adventuring to become strong enough to defeat. You saw Illidan here and there, there was Lady Vash here and there, but Illidan was, of course, the big you are not prepared guy, but then suddenly, it's Kil'jaeden over at the Sunwell. There's the Burning Legion, but it was a little nebulous compared to Wrath of the Lich King. It's about Arthas, it's about the Lich King, it's about taking down the bad guy that's been sitting on the frozen throne since Warcraft 3. Very iconic. And there was, except for Borean Tundra and some other flukes in the outdoor world, a lot of the zones had some really good stories going in them. I used to joke Borean Tundra was boring Tundra because that zone, with the way it looks and plays, especially on the graphics that were in the game at the time, they've been updated since, but back then, Borean Tundra reminded me of a zone from Outland, more so than Howling Fjord. So I always preferred Howling Fjord for starting characters in Northrend. But Outland versus Northrend isn't the wackiest way that this is a cop-out with regards to this new leveling setup. If you compare Cataclysm to Mists of Pandaria, now you've got a real issue on your hands. Not just because there was a lot of negative attitudes towards Cataclysm. That was, by the way, the expansion that made Total Biscuit decide he didn't want to play the game anymore. Now, he was a World of Warcraft guy for years. He was one of the big guys on WoW Radio. He had his shows about video games and stuff, and he'd talk about WoW and things like that, and Cataclysm was where he's like, no, I just can't support this anymore. And so, one of the arguments at the time, especially when Dragon Soul came out and people just were underwhelmed by the raid in terms of finally taking down Deathwing. Okay, Deathwing's been torching the planet, now here's how we're going to defeat him, and there was recycled assets in the 5-man dungeons and stuff along those lines. No, a lot of the criticism towards Cataclysm was too many resources were taken away from making the Deathwing story interesting because of the old world revamp. Mists of Pandaria, though, has something even wackier on the Alliance side. You will be on the Alliance gunship at some point in the quests, and the NPC is going to say, this is the ship that took down Deathwing. And if you're playing Mists of Pandaria before Cataclysm, you're hearing, this is the ship that took down Deathwing, and then you're going to deal with Deathwing later on if you decide to change areas and go to the Cataclysm zones. So, a little bit of wacky stuff there. But overall, deprecating the story in everything but the current expansion, it is not something that I agree with what Blizzard's doing. And you don't see this in other games. Try playing Final Fantasy XIV. You'll have to buy a boost if you don't want to go through the entire overarching story of the Warrior of Light, now the Warrior of Darkness. But the main story quest is something that it tells a gradually unfolding story throughout the expansions as you approach Shadowbringers. I haven't touched Shadowbringers yet, but I actually still have some things I need to do in Stormblood before I can actually even start that game. So I'll renew the subscription when I can commit to actually going through the story and getting that done, and probably shut everything else off, including ESO Plus, in order to do so. I think we've entered an era where if you're interested in multiple MMOs, you pretty much should toggle subscriptions and not spend money on a game that you're not playing. But if we look at this comment again, the thing about, the intent wasn't what ESO did with player freedom. Of course it wasn't. But this whole thing with just picking somewhere to level up was a cop-out. In some cases, you have stories that do not jive with one another that are now competing with one another. So you can do one set of content but not the other, or you can do them out of order. And that's not what the story of World of Warcraft is. Yes, the game is big enough that it would take a very long time just to get through the overarching story of everything. But it's just a natural effect of the game getting so big. Now let's talk about the whole half-cooked thing. There's a very specific reason why I think that Blizzard's attempts at world scaling is half-cooked. Why do you want to even have world scaling? We've just talked about it a lot, and that is, quite frankly, player freedom. So how do the games stack up against each other when it comes to player freedom? Does Blizzard provide the least amount of it? The answer is yes. If you want to 100% go through every story in the game, depending on the heirlooms you have and whatnot, you may end up needing to freeze your level in order to finish stuff before the deprecation thing kicks in and your damage gets boosted against mobs from old content. Meanwhile, in ESO, you just do whatever you want, whenever you want. But Tamriel is fundamentally different in its design, because today's ESO is not the ESO that it was in its disastrous launch. The original ESO was basically World of Warcraft with Tamriel trimmings on it. So there were only certain zones you could go to, there were levels, and you progressed through various parts of the Daggerfall Covenant or the Ebonheart Pact or the Aldmeri Dominion as your character leveled and stuff. One Tamriel was a radical shift away from the chasing WoW thing towards actually being an Elder Scrolls MMO. The offline Elder Scrolls games, Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, they have you get out of jail, basically, or prison at the beginning of the game, and then you can just do whatever you want. Here's a world, go do stuff in whatever order you want. It's all about player freedom. And one Tamriel in ESO basically just picked up where that left off. Your character gets out of the starting area, and you can just do whatever, go wherever, play wherever, go through whatever story. And so the breadth of the world with ESO is unparalleled. Of course, this does cause some scaling issues because none of the zones actually have any minimum level requirements. So you can just go anywhere at any time. Zones, dungeons, you get scaled to whatever the heck you want to do. So that is a problem. But it exists because that's what Elder Scrolls games are. You'll see things like leveled loot and leveled monsters in Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim, depending on where you go at what level. There isn't much for things getting harder unless you're going towards the main villain of the story very early on at a very low level. I mean, that's where you might run into some problems. But for the most part, Elder Scrolls games are about player freedom. And ESO, when they made the shift to one Tamriel, is exactly that. So the content is basically going to be like that. You're going to have main quests, and you're going to have quests that are little side quests for certain areas, and you'll have zone quests which tell the story of the zone, like in, say, Glenumbra or Bankarai or Auradon or whatever zone you happen to go through. The expansion packs and the DLC have something similar going on, but the thing is, the breadth of the content Elder Scrolls Online says just run in a direction if you're in one direction if you're looking for something to do, and you'll eventually run into a quest somewhere. They're not kidding. If you haven't done much in the game yet, you can just run in a direction and somebody will need help somewhere, a town will need saving, or there'll be a zone story that you can start. And you can also use the UI to get pointed to where you were in the zone story to continue where you left off or start something new. It's part of what Elder Scrolls games are. It's all about player freedom, and the ESO of today is more about player freedom than just about anything else out there, including Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 is closer to what WoW should be. You get dynamically down-leveled if you go back to old zones, but the dynamic down-leveling puts you at the top of the level range, and you still have some other things that make you more powerful than somebody at the top of the level range. So it's not a total face roll if you go back to old zones. But the big thing I like about Guild Wars 2 is that there are minimum zone levels, so you have to have advanced as an adventurer before you can go to the more dangerous parts of the world. Now, Blizzard almost has that with what they've done. If you throw aside, for example, some of the lazy design, like pitting expansions against each other, stuff like that I don't agree with. If you look at the way that level scaling was implemented in WoW, the big problem and why you might need to use the level freezer to go through and 100% complete the game on a character is because there are maximum levels for a zone. And that doesn't need to be the case. I mean, if you never got around to something and want to go back to it later, or in my case, with a character that's been around since before the world revamp, want to go through and not have it be a total face roll, you should be able to do that. And this is one of the ideas that is floating around the forums right now. Some kind of thing where you flag where you're down-leveled or phased into something where the world is a challenge for you, no matter where it is that you go, so that way it's not a total face roll. This is going back and forth on the forums. I've seen it going back and forth for quite some time. I imagine at some point, perhaps in the next expansion or in some kind of expansion level release, we'll probably see some kind of, or a major patch, we'll finally see Blizzard sheepishly introduce this good idea from other games, like they've done a lot of the other big ones. But all of this just points to me being right, that Blizzard's arrogance towards their players is still getting in the way of World of Warcraft taking its place among its rivals these days, now that it actually has viable competition. Even during the times when people say, oh look, it looks like Blizzard learned their lesson, because we've been through this before. There have been times when Blizzard appeared to learn their lesson and then they got arrogant again like a year or two later. This is a pattern with them, and until the behavior itself stops, this vicious cycle of people having a love-hate relationship with this game. They like it, they spend so much time in it, but they hate when Blizzard does this, that, or the other. It's just going to keep on going on. And the question is, if you want a consistently enjoyable experience in one of these MMO worlds, and you've been putting up with this for any amount of time whatsoever, whether it's a few years or all the way back to the original vanilla version of the game, when do you get off the merry-go-round and say enough is enough? Players could still feel progression, so to speak, with minimum levels only. You can't go running off to fight the Lich King at level 1. I mean, if Blizzard took off the maximum levels, they would have a very good thing on their hands. And that's what they need to do. There would still be player progression. You'd have to level a bit before you went into the more dangerous parts of the world, but you wouldn't have this stupid system where content becomes trivial because you didn't get around to a story or you weren't interested in a story when you were leveling through the area, and now you are. It's just the sort of thing that I don't expect Blizzard to get on board with without a long, drawn-out fight on the forums, in the media, at the BlizzCon Q&As. It's just, why do they have to drag their feet so much when you see actual friendly, professional discussion of design changes and game changes at places like, for example, the ZeniMax Online forums talking about ESO changes. And you're like, yeah, I get what they did. This was overpowered. That was underpowered. This kind of takes away from, the fantasy of what it's like to play a Breton or a High Elf or something like that. This makes sense. Even though it bothers me because my character's been nerfed, I can understand it and be mature about it. as opposed to what's been on the WoW forums over the years. I mean, how many times have the WoW forums been completely redone from scratch now? Is it 2, 3? You know, the original forums where a lot of these fights went on about spell damage for healers are long gone. And when I check the forums after reactivating my account, they've been redone again from the ground up. How many more times does Blizzard have to completely redo their forums before they realize that the way they treat their players contributes to a lot of the drama, as well as who the game attracts and who the game doesn't attract in terms of a player base? Now, let's talk about the content. Aside from the graphics, which were pretty much standardized in Warcraft 3, that's another discussion entirely. Yeah, there's a ton of content by mere virtue of the game being 15 years old, and how much of it is kill 10 boars, collect 10 apples, or some variant of that. I mean, there's an add-on out there that gives you what looks like dialogue instead of just a window popping up with text when you accept a quest. Meanwhile, you play ESO and everything's voiced. You go to do the story somewhere, there's voice actors, you'll talk to this elf about saving this village or something along those lines. I mean, no comparison. Some of this is a result of the game's age, but quite frankly, there are some things that Blizzard could tune up. Sadly, although Cataclysm got a lot of flack for too many resources being spent on redoing things that were already in the game, I think that's the bitter pill that Blizzard's going to have to swallow with some of the more dated parts of the game like Outland. At this point, as much as Cataclysm was poorly received because too many resources were diverted away to revamp the whole world, I seriously think that the game actually needs another revamp of the old world to update the stories, or DLC or something. They've got the phasing and the Bronze Dragonflight NPCs if you want to see the old stuff anyway, so what happened with Cataclysm doesn't have to happen again. Plus, Classic's going to be a huge wild card. I'm checking it out just as a curiosity, but I have no problem whatsoever with canceling my subscription and just playing ESO again if I'm, underwhelmed by the experience. Or, the wool gets pulled off of my eyes the way it's going to get pulled off of a lot of people's eyes with regards to how the game has progressed since 2006 when WoW Classic is supposed to, that's what WoW Classic's supposed to represent. And that's when I started playing the game. So it'll be pretty interesting to see how that works out. So one last thing with regards to information, now that I've spent the better part of a half an hour doing a podcast that is basically information overload compared to the gaming video that I made about World of Warcraft being an old game. This is a problem that I have with the gaming videos and the tech videos, and it has to do with video production in general. There's always the tug of war with video production between showing stuff and saying stuff. If you have video, you need to show stuff. You can't just say stuff. And a lot of the issues with pacing that you'll see in people's YouTube videos and the like, and stuff that just makes things boring, is when people are saying stuff instead of showing stuff because that's the easy way out. And it doesn't just happen with online video either. The other night at the 9 to 5, we had the Discovery Channel on the break room TVs, and the guys at Gas Monkey Garage, there's some Gas Monkey Garage marathon going on or something like that. But Gas Monkey Garage was on, and literally for about 7 or 8 minutes, the show was nothing more than a couple of guys around a table chattering with each other about stuff they were going to do to a car. No footage of them actually working on the car or anything like that, or an attempt to show them doing the work as they're discussing it. It was like something off of YouTube. Literally just folks they at least switched camera angles to show the different people speaking. But literally all it was just a couple of guys around a table blabbering back and forth about stuff they were going to do to the car. And I'm like, that's filler material. That is absolutely filler material to pad time in the episode between commercial breaks or overall in general. I'm like, this is not good video production. And if you look at some of the older tech videos that I have this constant problem of stopping and talking way too much. And that's one of the reasons why I have podcasts like this that are primarily designed to be listened to rather than watched. Because I acknowledge the obvious that with video production, you have to show stuff. But if you have a lot of stuff to say, grab a microphone and podcast it. Give people something to listen to while they're doing stuff around the house or on their phone or something along those lines. And one of the things I'm thinking of doing administratively is taking these playlists that are for videos, supposedly, and turning them into content playlists. So that way, for example, World of Warcraft, I can have the podcasts I've done about WoW included in the discussion or in the overarching thing for people to binge watch, as opposed to the videos that I make. And that's where podcasting fits into the grand scheme of things with the channel in general. With both gaming videos and tech videos, I've seen over the years, there is always the fight between saying stuff and showing stuff. If you have a lot to say, you need to have a way of saying it, like podcasts, and then reserve like the tech videos and the gaming videos for showing stuff and demonstrating stuff, and then tie everything together. That's something I've been wanting to do to varying levels of success for quite some time now. That video I did about World of Warcraft as an old game now was a great example of this struggle, and there are some tech videos that are the exact same way. It's all part of the struggle of trying to figure out what goes where and what I want where and stuff along those lines. And that's why podcasting on this channel has become more of a pronounced thing this year, among other things, because a lot of times I'll have a lot to say, and I don't have any way of really showing stuff at the same time, and so it becomes a total mess. You'll say, oh, that video should have been a podcast, and you'd be exactly right. So it was a struggle with the gaming video, particularly with me trying to get back into this format on a regular basis for the first time in a long time. Still kind of nailing out what exactly I want Play Some Stuff to be. So how's that for not enough information, I'm very biased, I have the wrong idea about Blizzard, etc.? I think I've covered the bases on where I'm coming from with this more than adequately. If anything, going too far in the other direction. But that's the whole situation here, is enough of this arguing for arguing's sake. I know why Blizzard does what they do. I know what they keep doing wrong over and over again, what annoys the player base over and over again, and quite frankly, I am not content to have my MMO experience consist of going round and round and round and round and round on a customer service merry-go-round like this. Hence, my support for ESO. Guild Wars 2 is a good game as well, but there's some technical issues with some of the ways in which the game runs these days. It's the worst running MMO of the bunch that I have, and it still runs off of DirectX 9. And from what I understand from people who've dissected the code, it's not the graphics part that is outdated, it's the more general part with how the game utilizes the CPU and everything. Which, by the way, is something that Blizzard has addressed with some of the big code changes in World of Warcraft that basically make it into almost like a League of Legends cartoon at this point. World of Warcraft has always been cartoony, but what we have nowadays with the combat revamp and stuff like that, it just looks like they're going after some of these MOBAs in terms of how the game looks and feels in order to, or maybe that's lessons learned from Overwatch. I mean, Overwatch is pretty cartoony as well. I've never played Overwatch, so I've only seen people play it on YouTube, and all the screaming and hollering and stuff about Overwatch reminds me of the screaming and hollering that has existed in WoW. So, again, Blizzard, this comes back to their behavior and the way they treat others, and the institutionalized narcissism that has to be rooted out of their culture, or else we're just going to keep seeing this over and over again. And the question for you, the listeners, is, do you want to put up with that? Do you want to go round and round and round on the merry-go-round, or do you want to get off the ride and realize there's other places that don't have these problems that you can go be perfectly happy with in the gaming world? Thanks for listening, everybody. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.